What's up guys, welcome to a new episode of Filmmaking Friday. Today we're going to talk all about the ISO of your camera. Filmmaking Friday. Welcome back to the series. Today we're going to dive into the world of ISO. ISO is a fundamental concept in photography and filmmaking that determines the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor. So let's get started. ISO, which stands for International Organization of Standardization, measures the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor to light. A higher ISO value makes the sensor more sensitive to light, while a lower value reduces its sensitivity. But of course, it's not just that easy. As many of you probably know, bumping up the ISO often introduces noise, which is a mostly unwanted side effect. By adjusting the ISO, you can control the exposure of your footage in different lighting conditions. Let's explore how the ISO affects your footage in various scenarios. When shooting in low light conditions such as at night or in dimly lit interiors, you may need to increase the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive to the available light. This allows you to capture properly exposed footage without having to rely heavily on artificial lighting. However, of course, higher ISO values introduce more digital noise or grain in your footage. This noise can affect the image quality and result in a loss of detail. Therefore, it's crucial to strike a balance between achieving proper exposure and keeping noise levels under control. In well-lit situations such as outdoor daytime shots or when using adequate artificial lighting, you can use a lower ISO value. Lower ISO settings produce cleaner images with less noise and better overall image quality. It's also worth mentioning that modern cameras like the Sony Alpha series offer better noise performances at higher ISO values compared to older models. This just gets better every year. So don't be afraid to experiment and push the ISO limits of your camera to achieve the desired exposure in challenging lighting conditions. Now every camera has a base ISO, which is typically the lowest native ISO setting that produces the cleanest and least noisy image. While you can adjust the ISO higher or lower, it's generally best to stick to the base ISO whenever possible to achieve an optimal image quality. Here's an example of how bumping up the ISO affects your image, starting out with the base ISO of 100. ISO 200, 400, 800, all still fine on the A7S II. I shot this test on the A7S II back in 2020. Of course now we have the A7S III, but this is from the A7S II. At ISO 1600 we see that some noise is introduced. 3200, 6400, 12800. Now it's starting to fall apart. And here at 25600, 51200, 102,400, 204,800 and all the way up at 409,600. Yes, the Sony A7S series really goes up all the way over 400,000. It's really just usable for, like, for example, news footage or something like that if you really just want to see something and use the camera as a night vision device to make something visible. For example, if you want to film a UFO, you really have to bump it up to see it, then it's okay to use it. The basic rule of thumb is keep your ISO down because the lower the ISO, the less noise, the better the image quality, and the higher the ISO, the more noise, which worsens the image quality. However, some cameras, like for example the Sony FX6 right here, have a dual native ISO. This means the camera has two ISOs on which the image is the cleanest and the noise is the least visible. So in the example of the Sony FX6, we have a native ISO with almost no noise at ISO 800, then more noise as we go to ISO 1600, 3200 and so on. But then when we get to ISO 12800, which is already very high, suddenly most of the noise disappears again because we're back at the second native ISO. So it's important to keep your camera's native ISO in mind, especially if you have a camera with a dual native ISO, because then maybe you should bump up your ISO even more to get a more clean image, and then maybe even use a small ND filter in low light conditions to get a more clean image, which is just insane. Additionally, when shooting with high ISO settings, be mindful of the dynamic range of your camera. High ISO values can reduce the camera's ability to capture a wide range of highlights and shadows, resulting in a loss of detail in those areas. In post-production, it's possible to reduce noise by using a noise reduction software or plugins. However, of course, it's always preferable to capture clean footage with an appropriate ISO setting during production, as excessive noise reduction can also affect the image quality. So to summarize, ISO is a crucial tool in filmmaking that allows you to control the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor. It helps you to achieve proper exposure in different lighting conditions, but be mindful of the trade-off between exposure and noise levels. Now that's it for today's episode on ISO. I hope you found it informative and useful. As always, feel free to leave any questions down below in the comments or hit me up on my socials on Instagram or yeah, that's basically it on Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Next week we're going to talk all about the focal length of a lens from a camera, you know, the millimeter thing. So be sure to come back for that. See you next time.